My talk focuses on late 19th and early 20th century elocution as an academic discipline. I will address elocution's relationships with its own past as a discipline, as well as with contemporary, so early 20th century or near contemporary poetry and literary criticism. Now, elocution. Elocution was a curious thing, at least in our eyes today. It theorized the reading aloud of literary text from the page before an audience. This is an image. This is Charles Dickens' reading, so that's earlier in the 19th century. Important to know is that it looked at literature from the perspective of rhetoric and oratory, the tradition from which elocution emerged. The term elocution derives from elocutio, which in classical rhetoric meant stilistics, but was redefined in the 18th century to mean delivery, so the oral component of rhetoric. A careful examination of turn-of-the-century elocution can shed new light on some stubborn prevailing ideas about modernism's relationship with rhetoric. It's a familiar commonplace of literary history that modernism was at its core anti-rhetorical and even succeeded in putting an end to the tradition of rhetoric and oratorical speech in the realm of literature. Additionally, the notion that an oral or oratorical approach to literature was definitively abandoned when modernist literature and new criticism became the academic norm in the Anglo-American world appears self-evident. And it's true, and some of these examples have come along, that Ezra Pound and T.S. Eliot, inspired by English and French symbolist critics and by William Butler Yeats, developed a critical discourse in which rhetoric came to stand really for everything that they rejected in their immediate predecessors, and for everything they thought was wrong with poetic language, even with language in general. To make it new was then to resist poetry's popular appeal as song or speech, to purge poetic language of vague symbolist abstraction, to abandon stalemate metric patterns requiring ornamental verbosity, and to break up the commonplaces and cliches of everyday language and to develop highly individual idioms as an antidote to the collectively shared linguistic system. And although this was underwritten by some modernists at a certain point in time, this attitude cannot as such be extrapolated to modernism as a whole, nor can it justify the claim that modernism broke with rhetoric and oratory. For on the one hand, as such I just said, the dominance and the prestige of traditional rhetoric, the rhetorical system, had already been buried in the 19th century. Yet on the other hand, the narrative of modernist anti-rhetoricality treats the different forms of rhetoric and oratory as if they had remained unchanged since the 19th century, or it neglects them altogether. It denies the fact that the practice of rhetoric knew development of its own. It transformed alongside large-scale social, political, and intellectual changes. And in this paper I tried to show that modernist writers and elocutionists were not as alien to each other as might be assumed, but were thinking and working sometimes along parallel lines. Mark Morrison and Carrie Preston have both written about the phenomenon of elocution as a popular practice in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, Morrison for Great Britain and Preston for the United States. And I will make grateful use of their scholarship, but I reorient the focus to the academic world and to elocution's place in the university and in the history of literary study. The 2 cases I will focus on today, 2 elocutionists, Samuel Silas Curry and Solomon Henry Clark, can be regarded as representative of a late phase of elocution. It was a self-conscious phase, coinciding with the professionalization and specialization of the academic world, when different types of literary study vied for legitimacy. Elocution had long enjoyed popularity and academic acceptance, but it lost its central place after the departmentalization of academic learning, when its value to a research-oriented curriculum was questioned. Yet because this crisis engendered debate within the discipline itself, It could be argued that it allowed elocution to flourish again with people like Clarke and Curry, whom I will discuss. So our elocutionary heroes of today tried to develop alternatives to what they denounced as the mechanical elocution of an earlier phase, the mid-19th century, when elocution had become academically stale or had degenerated into excesses of pure histrionic showmanship. What they called mechanical elocution was found in countless textbooks providing little theory and much practice. The result was that elocution came under attack for offering mindless, imitative exercises. And I brought two examples. One is Rupert Carey, a British mid-Victorian elocutionist who published Elocution, Voice and Gesture. A substantial part of that book was devoted to annotated recitation pieces, as illustrated by this excerpt from The Charge of the Light Brigade. So you have marginal notes instructing the student on which sentiments or which moods to convey and how to modulate the voice to evoke these moods. So it prescribes a kind of minimal interpretation of the poem. And an American example of the same type is Rufus Clagett's Elocution Made Easy. In this case, drawings were inserted to illustrate step by step the gestures to be performed upon pronouncing the consecutive lines of the poem. And Sarah brought great Disney images, but I will of course perform. I've practiced all night. So it goes this way. The wind was high, the window shakes. With sudden start the miser wakes. Along the silent room he stalks, looks back and trembles as he walks. Why not? Thank you, that's as far as I got. I can't bear. Now, counteracting this trend, the late phase of elocution was characterized by a thorough alliance with psychological insights. Psychology was a rapidly developing field in the second half of the 19th century, and consciously or unconsciously, elocutionists adopted principles of the new psychology, of physiological psychology, as it was disseminated by writers such as Herbert Spencer, Henri Bergson, William James, and John Dewey. Patricia Ray has argued that literary criticism's preference for psychoanalysis has sometimes obscured the fact that physiological psychology, I quote, had wide-ranging consequences for the way writers and artists conceived of themselves and their art. So the first example is Samuel Silas Curry, educated at Boston University's School of Oratory, and founder and president of the School of Expression, his own private school, also in Boston, from 1883 until his death in 1921. Curry avoided the term elocution itself and presented his own theory under the name expression. In The Province of Expression, he writes that, I quote, "The most fundamental element of expression is the idea of revelation of man's psychic nature through his physical organism." End quote. Although this may sound vague, it captures quite well the direction in which Curry takes elocution here. Towards an integrated vision of the wholeness of mind and body, in which expression can only be successful if it naturally communicates genuine thoughts and emotions. This is how Curry countered mechanical elocution. The way to achieve perfect expression is to go along with processes that are found in nature, the laws of nature. Curry observes that all processes of natural growth are from within outward, from a center to extremities. And this becomes his fundamental creed for expression. I quote here, "These characteristics of expression in nature show that human expression must come from impulses within the breast of man, that there must be no external hindrance to the outflow of these of these through the whole linguistic organism. Expression must be the manifestation of the whole being through all the actions of voice and body. So not only should the body express itself spontaneously from its center to its extremities, so as to produce natural and graceful gestures, the body and the voice should also give spontaneous expression to the thoughts and feelings that are held in the mind. However, spontaneity does not mean utter freedom or pure intuition. All expression that the body does spontaneously, automatically, emotion is always spontaneous, Curry writes, has to be balanced by voluntary control, conscious deliberation. Given the fact that expression was tied up with the primacy of the mind, so much tied up with the primacy of the mind, sometimes the soul, the creative imagination and individual personality, Curry said he could not supply a ready-made system in which precise movements of the voice or the body corresponded to specific emotions, which was the case in earlier elocution in the 19th century. So he limited himself to two things. One, a theoretical outline, a general outline, about which functions of the voice expressed which mental actions, and also, secondly, a technical training of the vocal organs, a correct use of the voice. So the main functions of the voice, as I said, were to him pitch, so that height, low or high, and inflection, the direction of intervals of pitch, and tone color, the timbre of the voice. Pitch and inflection pertain to processes of thought and logic. A change of pitch follows, I quote, a change or departure of the mind from conception to conception, indicating that the reader has moved on from one idea or state of mind to the next. Different types of inflection, rising and falling, long, short, quick, abrupt, straight and circumflex, they reveal the attitude of the speaker towards the ideas expressed, so an attitude of intensity, earnestness, certainty or uncertainty. And tone color, the timbre of the voice, reveals emotion. And I quote again, every emotion causes a texture of the muscles peculiar to itself. Love softens the muscles, and so the voice. Anger hardens the muscles, and so makes harsh the tone. But none of these general principles can be regulated by rule, Curry stated. Therefore, vocal training can only try to improve the suppleness or the responsiveness of the voice. And this is where we find the influence of psychologists like Spencer and James. Curry declared that spoken English is a psychological problem, and that, I quote, to find psychological causes, not only of the expressive modulations of the voice, but of the conditions of the mind and body required for its right training and correct use. A central concern for Curry was habit. Habit was a key term in 19th century psychology and morality. James regarded habit as at bottom, a physical principle, explaining habitual actions as those that choose the line of least resistance by following deeply entrenched paths in the nervous system. And Curry's mission was to remove ingrained bad habits by exercising conscious control over the obstacle blocking fluent expression. So he said faults of the voice are the result of habit, so he went along with James. But training, in his view, was capable of restoring the natural coordination between mind and voice. So I argue that Curry fused a somewhat mystic tradition of bodily aesthetics that reveals the soul with the physiological psychology of Spencer and James. And this makes it clear how Curry's project participated in what has been called the new kinesthetic by Hillel Schwartz. New kinesthetic was this distinctly modern reinvention of man, not as the fragmented mechanical puppet of industrialized society, but as an organically whole being, that is in essence outfitted to act and move as a harmonious unity, but that also needs to be educated in accordance with its organic nature in order to let it be itself. Drawing on examples from fields such as dance, handwriting, physical culture, fashion, and medicine, Schwartz recognizes a pattern of thinking that values individuality, wholeness of mind and body, and fluid movement flowing out of the body center. He concludes, I quote, "Current wisdom maintains that modern life, with its essentially industrialized momentum, has processed our world and our bodies into dissociated, fetishized, ultimately empty and machinable elements. Most perversely, he says, I have been positing the emergence of a new kinesthetic that insists upon rhythm, wholeness, fullness, fluidity, and a durable connection between the bodiliness of the inner core and the outer expressions of the physical self." Although it's clear that Curry's project falls squarely within this widely shared discourse of natural expression of the self, his scientific approach to physical training and his insistence on maybe machine-like responsiveness and efficiency of the body, the removal of bad habits so that the body works efficiently, seems to corroborate Tim Armstrong's comment on Schwartz that the new kinesthetic was perhaps not only an alternative to machine aesthetics, but that its ideals of frictionless movement showed a complete internalization of machine aesthetics. And I think that's the case for Curry's theory. Then I move to Solomon Henry Clark, a contemporary of Curry. I'll try to be concise about him by comparing him to Curry. He is important because he was a transition figure, I think. Clark worked at the University of Chicago as a professor of public speaking. But he clearly also belonged to the same northeastern USA elocutionary milieu as did Curry. Clark's own project participated in the turn of the century move towards expression, rejecting the artificiality of rule-bound elocution and promoting the vocal reading of a text as the manifestation of the reader's individual response to the poem. In his book, Interpretation of the Printed Page, Clark wrote that expression, I quote, must be the natural, spontaneous response to an impression, which is a statement that could be taken straight from Curry's theory. Yet, where Curry fused a mystical philosophy of expression with psychology, Clark bypassed the mysticism and went straight for psychology. In Principles of Vocal Expression, he dealt with, in his own words, relations of vocal expression to psychology and rhetoric and to physiology. And it continued, this book is concerned more especially with what may be called mental technique or the mental side of technique. In this, as in all technical development, the true object is the establishment of normal conditions, out of which rational expression shall come with spontaneity, ease, and precision, because both mind and body are working most economically, that is, in conformity with ascertained laws of nature. Remarkable, however, about Clark's method is that he writes hardly a word about the voice and how it should sound. It looks like Clark assumes that the literary examples he provides speak for themselves, since, for instance, the chapter on emotion in Principles of Vocal Expression contains sections on suppressed feeling, stern, severe, or harsh feeling, oppressed or covered feeling, and agitated feeling, all types of emotions that consist really of nothing but extracts. The reason appears to be that Clark was more interested in how the voice instructed the imagination and the reading comprehension, the interpretation that is, than in how the imagination instructed the voice. The difference in priorities was made explicit in Interpretation of the Printed Page, which stated, beautiful as is the adequate vocal interpretation of literature, it is of infinitesimally less worth in a system of education than the ability to interpret silently. So Clarke focused on how readers proceed in constructing a meaning from a literary text. He tackled the process of grouping, for instance, in which groups of words are identified that constitute a unit of meaning, and the transition between these groups, grouped sequence. And he also treats denotation, connotation, so the meaning of words depending on the context in which they appear. And in the chapter on emotions, Clarke states that a reader of poetry has to recreate the emotions of the poet, which, I quote, must be gathered solely from the text. So given these two elocutionists and their self-positioning in their discipline and their methods of dealing with literary texts, I argue that they not only modernized their own discipline, but also that they placed a clear step towards textual criticism. If the new critics became the standard of modern literary criticism, it could be argued that there existed more of a difference in kind between the new critics and positivist literary historians against which they reacted. While there was only a difference in degree between the new critics and the new elocutionists, where the historians approached the meaning of text via the life and times of the author, the elocutionists developed in the end a purely textual approach to meaning, while maintaining that they were able to bring out the meaning contained in a text. Clarke credited the influence of the Chicago-based professor Richard Green Moulton, now largely forgotten, whose theory of scientific criticism to a considerable extent anticipated new criticism. Even though new critic John Crowe Ransom singled out Chicago's English department as an example of good practices in professional criticism, Moulton goes unmentioned, while Ronald Crane is highly commended. And it's true, Mark reminded me to go back to that essay, Criticism Inc. yesterday, that that Ransom also writes negatively about these professors who read aloud. Nonetheless, Moulton's book, Richard Green Moulton's book, The Modern Study of Literature of 1915, maintained that literary criticism should be objective, inductive, and formalist. He called it intrinsic. Following his lead, Clarke set out to study the laws underlying literature, beginning with the law of unity. All elements of the interpretation must conform to the principal meaning. And while it is of course true that the academic elocutionists continued to value very personal responses to texts, it can be argued that they themselves in fact tipped the scales, ultimately giving primacy to silent textual criticism. Then I also want to look at the realm of the new poetry, the very first emergence of a modernist poetry in the United States. The modern American poetry that emerged when elocution was still common practice, and that was created by writers who were themselves schooled in it. It is, so I think it's now a matter of looking for alternatives to what literary criticism has traditionally termed the visual or spatial form that is valued by modernist poets. Now, there's one direct link between the modern turn in American elocution, Curry, Clarke, and contemporaneous poetry, and that's the figure of Rachel Lindsay. Julia Walker has also pointed out this same fact in her study of American Expressionist theater. Lindsay was a poet from Illinois, who came to prominence in 1913 via Harriet Monroe's magazine Poetry. As John Timberman Newcomb has shown, this was exactly the time when poetry in the United States found its second breath after nearly 2 decades of aesthetic inertia, a dwindling market, and much pessimism about its very survival as a literary genre. Lindsay has been included in categories such as the new poetry, Chicago Renaissance, popular modernism, popular partly on account of his performance practice. He believed in poetry as an oral art form, and he did not regard entertainment as a dirty word. Not that he was uncritical about popular entertainment. Maybe I should have said he did not regard popularity as a dirty word. Lindsay himself, and that's the direct link, confessed his debt to Solomon Henry Clark, this man. So it is tempting to take this at face value as a proof of elocution's imprint on modernist poetry. Lindsay stated, do I have? No. I had always tried to bring out tone color according to some lectures by Professor Clark of the Department of Public Speaking of the University of Chicago that I heard when in high school. In the Congo, I made my usual effort to elaborate tone color effects. The Congo is Lindsay's most famous poem. I handed out an extract, and one that he very often performed. Yet, it's unclear how this tells us something about Lindsay's performance aesthetic. For one thing, tone color was in Clark's theory a textual phenomenon, independent from recitation. It does not pertain, while it did in Curry's theory, in Clark's theory it doesn't pertain to the timbre of the voice. It means that certain verbal sounds, certain long vowels and successive letters in words intrinsically carried connotative meanings. Yet another reason is Lindsay's performance practice itself, which was far more eccentric than elocutionists would have tolerated. I wanted to play a sound clip and then talk some more, but I'll keep it short. So let's listen to. I'm going to a random passage. It's going to start now.
One. They're basic. Very. That's what no line bound unstable. I do on the table, pounded on the table, beaten and the arrow, the handle of a room, hard as they were able to with the umbrella and the handle of a room, and I sailed on. Then I had a vision, I could not turn from their revel in division. And I saw the Congo wishing through the black.
Okay, we get a sense of it. It's not for nothing that Lindsay categorized some of his poems, including this one, as higher vaudeville, indicating that he borrowed at least as greedily from popular theater as from elocution. Lindsay's performance style has also been understood as the performance of a vigorous manliness at a time when not only literary popularity but also public performance of poetry was deemed feminizing. And I think that's correct. Lindsay, in some of his letters and other writings, he boasted of how loud he could go, how he could fill a room with sound and thrust his voice until the end of the room. So loudness as a masculinist boast is interesting because in elocution theories, loudness is rejected. You don't have to raise your voice in that way because it reveals nothing. It reveals nothing of what is in your mind while you're reading. So performance poetry was deemed feminizing, and I discussed male elocution teachers, but their schools and the stages were largely populated by women. Now, what's more important than the question if Clark directly influenced Lindsay and in which way is the fact that he turned to oral performance precisely in an attempt to modernize and revitalize poetry. the very idea that poetry should be heard in public, that it could still mean something if it was read aloud, not only by himself but also by others. That's why he included marginal notes to poems like the Congo, because he envisioned his poetry as a participatory art form. If we look beyond, maybe we have to look beyond this oddball of a Rachel Lindsay, some of his contemporaries also made use of public readings. All of them poets who shared the same moment of poetic revitalization in the United States. Carrie Preston, in her book, has discussed Amy Lowell, who regarded poetry as a spoken art, and whose public persona was linked to her lively performances. And another writer who shared Lindsay's view on oral poetry, but remained more bound to conventional reading, the conventional reading style of elocution, was Carl Sandburg. Sandburg took elocution courses at Lombard College, and he used his skills to read his free verse poems before audiences across the United States. Finally, I think even William Carlos Williams, who started working on what he wanted to be a typically American poetry around the same time, does not escape this context of elocution, nor the company of Lindsay, Lowell, and Sandburg. Williams' own ideas about poetic rhythm agreed quite well, for instance, with Amy Lowell's definition of free verse. And I'll quote, "The definition of vers libre is a verse form based upon cadence." Now, cadence is not meter. To understand vers libre, one must abandon all desire to find in it the even rhythm of metrical feet. One must allow the lines to flow as they will when read aloud by an intelligent reader. The new rhythms will become evident, satisfying and delightful. For this poetry definitely harks back to the old oral tradition. It is written to be spoken. And another quote, "Free verse poems are built upon organic rhythm, or the rhythm of the speaking voice, with its necessity for breathing, rather than upon a strict metrical system. Free verse within its own law of cadence has no absolute rules. It would not be free if it had." Now, although Williams disclaimed the term vers libre at an early stage, because he thought a line could not be a poetic line if it was free of form. Yet Williams, like Lowell, regarded speech, I quote, "speech as the fountain of the line." And the notion of the line as a unit of breath underlies much of his writing. For Lowell, as for Williams, rhythm appeared to be paramount, and rhythm was a complex term around the turn of the century, circulating in all kinds of discourses, from physics to ethnography to art, but it always somehow connoted modernity. Theories of physiological rhythms also obviously informed our elocutionists and the rest of the new kinesthetic of the 20th century. Williams wrote in an early essay, "No work in words that is not regularly rhythmic and periodic can be of highest imagination. The purpose I have is to clarify the practical understanding of English speech rhythms in work of highest imagination." Because rhythm is a constant periodic motion in time, the traditional poetic foot, counting a fixed number of syllables, cannot embody the rhythm unit. The new rhythms of the modern poetic line will be based on embodied speech, and thus on what Lowell called organic rhythms proper to an oral art. To conclude, without necessarily suggesting that the new elocution somehow explains the historical emergence or the aesthetic choices of modernist poetry, the examples illustrate, I think, that modernist poetry was not as fundamentally hostile to elocutionary theories and practices. On the one hand, American poetry grew on the culture of public reading that had been kept alive by elocution. On the other hand, turn-of-the-century elocution was simply very much of its time and developed modern styles of performing and interpreting literary texts. So rhetoric clearly had not died by the beginning of the 20th century, and modernist literature or modernist criticism by no means dealt a final blow to the culture of public speaking and to the rhetorically informed oral reading of literary text.